Somebody get me some Sanitizer. I just touched his case file.
Judge Catherine Whitfield shoved the folder away and wiped her hands on her robe. Slow, deliberate. His lawyer stepped forward.
Your Honor, my client has evidence.
Whitfield smiled.
You could put a suit on a stray dog, still ends up in the pound.
A bailiff smirked. A juror looked away. Nobody spoke up.
But Terrence didn't drop his eyes. Quiet. Still. Like a man counting down to something only he knew was coming. She sentenced him to death that afternoon.
This court
For a murder
sentences
he
you
didn't
to death.
commit. That judge had no idea what she just started. And by the time she found out, it was already too late. Man, and that's just the beginning. Because what they did to this man, it gets worse. Way worse. Let's go back a few days. Before the handcuffs. Before the sentence. Before any of this. Terrence Robinson was a concrete worker at a construction site on the east side of Braden County. He showed up at 5 in the morning, poured foundations until his shoulders burned, and went home to cook dinner for his 2 kids. His wife had passed away 2 years earlier. Car accident on a rainy highway. Nothing dramatic. Just a life gone in a second. After that, Terrence did everything alone. Work, school pickups, homework at the kitchen table, weekend baseball practice at the park behind the church. He wasn't loud about it. He just did it. On a Tuesday evening in October, a white businessman named Harold Gaines was found dead behind that same construction site. Blunt force trauma to the head. No witnesses, no weapon recovered. But the police found one thing near the body, a pair of work gloves. And those gloves had Terrence Robinson's name written on the inside with black marker. That was it. That was the whole case, Terrence's gloves. At a construction site where he worked every single day, where he wore those gloves to pour concrete, carry rebar, and haul lumber. Gloves he could have left anywhere on any given afternoon. But Detective Ray Sullivan didn't care about that. He had a dead white businessman, a neighborhood demanding answers, and a phone call from Senator Hal Dawson's office asking why nobody had been arrested yet. Sullivan needed a name. Terrence Robinson was the closest one. They picked him up at 6 in the morning. His kids were eating cereal in the kitchen when the officers came through the front door. His daughter dropped her spoon. His son didn't cry. He just stood very still and watched them put the cuffs on his father. Terrence looked back at them and said, "I'll be home tonight." He believed it. He was wrong. Down at the county jail, things moved fast. A man named Derek Sims, already locked up on drug charges, told detectives he'd heard Terrence confess to the murder in a holding cell. Sims said Terrence bragged about it, said he described the weapon, said he laughed. None of it was true. Not a single word. But Sims had been promised something in return. A reduced sentence on his own charges. Detective Sullivan coached him on what to say, what details to include, which questions to expect on the stand. It was a transaction, a lie in exchange for freedom. And it worked. The case landed in front of Judge Catherine Whitfield. Now, let's talk about Catherine Whitfield. Because to understand what happened next, you have to understand who she was. Or at least, who she believed she was. Whitfield had been on the bench in Braden County for 30 years. More than 3,000 cases. 2 commendations from the State Bar Association. A framed letter from the governor hanging in her office. She came from old money. Her father was a state senator. Her grandfather sat on the same bench she now occupied. In Braden County, the Whitfield name wasn't just respected, it was the law. And Catherine Whitfield ran her courtroom like a kingdom. When Terrence's case came before her, she didn't see a man. She didn't see a father. She didn't see a concrete worker with clean hands and no record. She saw exactly what she always saw when a black man stood in her courtroom: a conviction waiting to happen. From the very first hearing, the pattern was set. Whitfield never once called Terrence by his name. It was always the defendant. She scheduled hearings at 6:30 in the morning, early enough that Terrence's mother, Naomi, had to take 2 buses in the dark just to make it on time. When the prosecution introduced character evidence that had nothing to do with the case, Terrence's neighborhood, his income, the fact that he was a single father, Whitfield allowed every word of it. The defense attorney objected. She overruled him without looking up. Then came the moment that sealed it. Terrence's court-appointed lawyer, a young public defender named Paul Chambers, already juggling 43 other cases, asked for a continuance. He needed more time to investigate. He'd found inconsistencies in Derek Sims's statement. He wanted to request independent testing on the gloves. He stood before the bench and said, "Your Honor, 3 more weeks could mean the difference between a conviction and the truth." Whitfield stared at him for a long moment. Then she said, "If your client had something useful to say, he would have said it by now. Motion denied." 3 weeks. That's all Chambers was asking for. 21 days. Enough time to test the blood on those gloves. Enough time to find out the truth. Whitfield didn't give him one. The trial lasted 4 days. Derek Sims took the stand and delivered his rehearsed testimony without a single stumble. The prosecution called it compelling. Chambers tried to cross-examine, but every meaningful question was shut down by sustained objections. The jury never heard the inconsistencies. They never heard about the blood that was never tested. They heard what Whitfield allowed them to hear, and nothing more. On the 4th day, Whitfield delivered the sentence: death by lethal injection. She said the word overwhelming when she described the evidence. She said the people of Braden County deserve to feel safe. Her voice was flat, almost bored, like she was reading a parking ticket. In the gallery, Naomi Robinson collapsed. Her legs gave out. A bailiff moved toward her, not to help, to remove her. Whitfield didn't pause. She didn't even glance at the gallery. She simply closed the file, stood up, and walked out. And here's the thing. If you read the court transcript, everything looked proper. Every objection was noted. Every ruling was cited. Every box was checked. That was the entire point. Whitfield didn't break the rules. She bent them. Slowly, precisely, methodically, until they broke someone else. Now fast forward to the present. A federal courtroom. Whitfield is sitting in the witness chair at her own misconduct hearing, and her attorney is painting her as a hero under siege. Judge Whitfield dedicated 30 years of her life to public service. She has been a pillar of justice in this community, and now she is being attacked by a convicted criminal desperate to escape the consequences of his own actions. Whitfield nods along, composed, polished. She straightens her collar. When she's asked to respond to the allegations, she says, "I followed the law to the letter. Every ruling I made was grounded in statute and precedent. Any suggestion of racial bias is an insult to the bench and to the justice system itself." Then she glances across the room at Terrence Robinson. A quick look, barely a second. But it's the same look she gave him in that courtroom days ago. Eyes that see right through a person and find nothing worth stopping for. She still doesn't see him as a threat. She still thinks this is her courtroom. She's wrong. And she's about to find out exactly How wrong. When Terrence Robinson stood up in that federal courtroom, nobody expected much. He was representing himself. No lawyer, no legal team, just a man in a prison jumpsuit and a stack of handwritten papers. Whitfield's attorney, a sharp-jawed man named Gerald Crawford, objected before Terrence even opened his mouth. "Your Honor, the petitioner has no legal counsel. This court should not be subjected to the ramblings of a construction worker who apparently believes he can do what trained attorneys do. This is a federal proceeding, not a community workshop." Judge Gregory Abrams, a black man with silver temples and 30 years on the federal bench, looked at Crawford over his glasses. "The Constitution gives every citizen the right to represent themselves, Counselor. I suggest you sit down and let the man speak." Crawford sat. Whitfield shifted in her seat. And Terrence Robinson opened his mouth. But he didn't start with the law. He started with a Tuesday morning.
"I used to wake up at 4:15, he said, "every morning, same time. I'd make oatmeal for my kids. My daughter liked hers with brown sugar. My son wanted blueberries, always blueberries. I'd pack their lunches, walk them to the bus stop, then drive to the construction site. I poured concrete for a living. My hands were cracked year-round. My back hurt every night. But I never missed a day. Because after my wife passed, there was nobody else. Just me."
The courtroom was quiet. Not the restless quiet of impatience, the still quiet of people actually listening. A juror in the second row uncrossed her arms. A clerk stopped typing. "On weekends," Terrence continued, "I coached Little League at the park behind Mount Olive Church. 12 kids, most of them from the neighborhood. I brought the bats because the league couldn't afford new ones. I drove the kids home after practice because some of their parents worked double shifts." He paused. "That's who I am. That's who was standing in Judge Whitfield's courtroom. But she never heard any of that, because she never asked." Then Terrence shifted. His voice didn't change. Same calm, same steady rhythm, but the content did. He moved from his life to the trial, and this is where people in the courtroom started leaning forward. "Let me walk you through what happened in that courtroom," he said. "Not my version, not my feelings, just the decisions. 6 specific decisions that Judge Whitfield made over the course of 4 days."
He held up one finger.
Decision 1. She scheduled the first hearing at 6:30 in the morning. My mother is 68 years old. She takes 2 buses to get to the courthouse. That hearing time guaranteed she'd either arrive late or not at all.
Second finger.
Decision 2. My court-appointed attorney, Paul Chambers, asked for a 3-week continuance to investigate inconsistencies in the prosecution's key witness. Judge Whitfield denied it. She said, and I'm quoting from the transcript, "If your client had something useful to say, he would have said it by now." 3 weeks. That's all he asked for. Third finger. Decision 3. The prosecution introduced character evidence. My neighborhood, my income level, the fact that I was a single father. None of that had anything to do with the murder of Harold Gaines. My attorney objected. Whitfield overruled him. Every single time. Fourth finger. Decision 4. She allowed the testimony of a jailhouse informant named Derek Sims, a man with active charges of his own, without requiring any corroborating evidence. No physical proof, no secondary witness, just the word of a man who had every reason to lie. Fifth finger. Decision 5. When my attorney tried to cross-examine Sims on his plea deal, the prosecution objected. Whitfield sustained it. The jury never learned that Sims was offered a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. Sixth finger.
Decision 6. She never once referred to me by my name. Not once in 4 days. It was always the defendant. Every time. Like I wasn't a person standing in front of her. Like I was just a file she needed to close.
Terrence lowered his hand. Now, any one of those decisions on its own might look minor. A scheduling choice, an evidentiary ruling, a denied motion. But put them together, all 6 in sequence in the same trial against the same defendant, and you don't get due process. You get a conveyor belt. And I was on it. Crawford jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is emotional theater, not evidence. The petitioner is wasting this court's time with personal anecdotes and conspiracy theories.
Terrence turned to look at him. Not fast, not aggressive, just a slow, steady turn, like a man who had all the time in the world. And he said, I'm getting to the evidence, Counselor. I promise you'll want to be seated for it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Abrams didn't call for order. He just watched. Terrence placed his hand on the stack of papers in front of him. He didn't open it, not yet. He let the silence hold. I've spent every night since I was locked up building this, he said, page by page. Not just about my case, about a pattern that goes back years. He looked at the bench. Everything in this courtroom is about to change, Your Honor. But first, the court needs to understand how we got here. Now here's what nobody in that room understood yet. Not Crawford, not the gallery, not even Judge Abrams. They were listening to Terrence the way you listen to a desperate man making his last stand. They heard the emotion, they heard the conviction, but they missed the details. They missed the way he cited case law, specific rulings, specific years, without glancing at a single page. They missed the way he used terms like exculpatory evidence and Brady violation as naturally as a man ordering coffee. They missed the way his argument was structured, not like a prisoner's plea, but like a federal appellate brief, clean, precise, layered. A federal marshal, standing near the side door, tilted his head slightly. He'd been in enough courtrooms to recognize something. He just couldn't place what it was. Not yet. Nobody asked Terrence where he learned to speak like that. Nobody wondered why a concrete worker could cite case law from memory. They looked at the jumpsuit, the handwritten pages, the calloused hands, and they saw what they expected to see. That was their first mistake. Now let's go back. Back to the cell. Back to the hours after the sentence came down. The door closed behind Terrence Robinson at 11:14 at night. A concrete cell. A steel bunk bolted to the wall. A fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered but never fully went out. No window. No clock. Just the hum of the light and the sound of his own breathing. Most men would have broken down. Most men would have sat on that bunk and stared at the wall and tried to figure out where their life had gone. Terrence didn't. He sat on the floor, borrowed a pen from a guard, and started writing. And here's the part of the story that nobody knew yet. The part that changes everything. Terrence Robinson wasn't just a concrete worker before the construction sites, before the calloused hands and the 5 a.m. shifts and the orange jumpsuit. Terrence Robinson had attended Howard University School of Law. He graduated top of his class. He passed the Georgia State Bar on his first attempt, scoring in the top 2%. He'd interned at the federal prosecutor's office. He was on track for a career in constitutional law. Then, his wife died, and everything changed. The firm he was supposed to join offered their condolences and a start date. But Terrence had 2 children under the age of 5, and no family nearby except his mother, who was already working 2 jobs. He couldn't do 80-hour weeks in a law office and raise 2 kids alone. So he made a choice. He put the law degree in a drawer at home, picked up a hard hat, and went to work pouring concrete. It paid less, but he was home by 5:30 every evening. He could cook dinner, help with homework, drive to Little League practice on Saturdays. Nobody at the construction site knew. His coworkers called him Terry. They knew he was quiet, showed up early, never complained. That was it. The degree sat in that drawer, untouched, for years. But knowledge doesn't disappear just because you stop using it. And now, sitting on the floor of a cell on death row, Terrence Robinson reached back into that drawer in his mind. And everything was still there. Every case, every statute, every precedent. He worked through the night. The pen moved fast. He drafted a motion for DNA retesting on the work gloves, written in proper legal format, citing the correct federal statutes, formatted exactly the way a federal appellate court would expect. Not a single error, not a single missing citation. A guard walking the block at 3 a.m. stopped and looked through the bars. He saw Terrence hunched over the floor, writing. "What are you doing? Writing your will?" Terrence didn't look up. "No, I'm writing my appeal." The guard laughed and kept walking. Terrence kept writing. Over the next few days, he worked without stopping. He wrote a letter to Derek Sims through the prison's internal mail system, carefully explaining in precise legal language that perjury in a capital case carried its own federal charges, and that Sims' best option was to recant now, voluntarily, before the appeals process exposed the deal he'd made. He filed a FOIA request for Judge Whitfield's complete sentencing records, a process he knew by heart from law school. He drafted his own habeas corpus petition. Every page was handwritten. Every page was flawless. And on the 3rd night, he made a phone call. The prison phone gave him 15 minutes. Naomi picked up on the first ring. She'd been sitting by the phone since the sentencing. She was crying before he said a word. "Mama," he said. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't—" "Mama, listen to me." His voice was steady, the same voice that would later fill a federal courtroom. "I don't need you to believe I'm going to win. I just need you not to lose hope. Can you do that?" The line was quiet for a long time. Then Naomi said, in a voice so soft the recording barely caught it, "I'll be waiting for you at the gate." Terrence closed his eyes. He held the phone against his forehead for a moment. Then he hung up, walked back to his cell, and picked up the pen. He has work to do. Back in the federal courtroom, the gallery was full, standing room only. Word had gotten around. A man on death row was representing himself. And he just walked the court through 6 procedural failures like he'd done it before. People wanted to see what came next. Terrence Robinson placed his hand on the stack of handwritten pages. He looked at Judge Abrams. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present my evidence." Abrams nodded. "Proceed." Terrence opened the stack to the first section. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble. He turned to the first page the way a surgeon picks up a scalpel, precise, deliberate, no wasted motion. "Let's start with the gloves," he said. He held up a photograph. The work gloves. The prosecution's star exhibit. The single physical item that tied him to the scene. "These are my gloves," he said. "I wore them every day at the construction site. My name is written inside in black marker.
Of course my DNA was on them. I wore them for months. That's not evidence of murder. That's evidence that I had a job.
A few people in the gallery almost smiled. But Terence wasn't making a joke. He was building a ladder. And the first rung was the one everybody expected. Now, he continued, there was blood on these gloves. Not a lot, a small stain on the left palm. In the original trial, the prosecution argued this was consistent with the attack on Harold Gaines. But here's what they didn't tell you, and here's what Judge Whitfield made sure the jury never heard. He paused. The blood was never tested. The courtroom shifted. A reporter in the third row looked up from her notebook. Crawford uncrossed his legs. My court-appointed attorney requested DNA analysis on that bloodstain during the original trial. Judge Whitfield denied the motion. She said it was, and again, I'm quoting the transcript, unnecessary and cumulative. A bloodstain on the key piece of physical evidence in a capital murder case. And she called it unnecessary. Terence reached into his stack and pulled out a single sheet. From my cell, I filed a federal motion for independent DNA testing under the Post-Conviction DNA Testing Act. The motion was granted. He held up the lab report. 2 independent laboratories tested the blood on those gloves. Both returned the same result. He read it out loud, slowly, making sure every word landed. The blood does not belong to the victim, Harold Gaines. The blood belongs to a man named Curtis Doyle. The courtroom erupted. Not shouting, more like a wave of gasps, chairs creaking, people turning to each other with wide eyes. Judge Abrams brought his gavel down twice. Order! I will have order in this courtroom. Terence waited for the silence to settle. Then he continued. Curtis Doyle, 41 years old at the time, 3 prior convictions for aggravated assault, documented history of violent behavior. He was living in a motel 6 blocks from the construction site during the week Harold Gaines was killed. Terence set the lab report down. Doyle died in a bar fight 2 years after my conviction. He was never investigated. He was never questioned. He was never even considered. Because by the time his name could have mattered, I was already on death row. Crawford was on his feet. Your Honor, this so-called evidence was obtained outside the original trial proceedings. The chain of custody is documented on pages 4 through 11 of the lab report, Terence said, without turning around. Verified by both laboratories. Notarized. Time-stamped. If counsel would like to review it, I have copies. Crawford sat down. He didn't ask for the copies. Terence moved to the second piece. I'd like to call Derek Sims. The side door opened. A man in a county jail jumpsuit was escorted to the witness chair. Derek Sims. The man whose testimony had put Terence on death row. He was thinner now. His hands were shaking before he even sat down. Terence looked at him. Not with anger, not with hatred, just with patience. Mr. Sims, in your testimony at my trial, you told the jury that I confessed to the murder of Harold Gaines while we were in a holding cell together. Is that true? Sims didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor. He looked at the judge. He looked at his own hands. Then he said, in a voice that barely carried past the first row, No. Could you say that louder, please? No. It wasn't true. None of it. Who told you what to say? Sims swallowed. Detective Sullivan. He came to me 3 times. He told me exactly what to say,
what words to use, what details to include. He said if I did it, he'd talk to the DA about my charges. He said I'd be out in 18 months instead of 6 years. And did you ever hear me confess to anything? No, I never even talked to you. We were in the same holding area for maybe 2 hours. You sat in the corner and didn't say a word to anybody.
Sims's voice cracked. He pressed his palms against his thighs to stop them from shaking. I've been carrying this since the day I got on that stand. I knew what I was doing. I knew it was wrong. And I did it anyway because I wanted to go home. He looked at Terrence. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. But I'm sorry. The courtroom was silent. A woman in the gallery was crying quietly. Naomi Robinson had her eyes closed, her lips moving in a prayer no one could hear. Terrence nodded at Sims. Just a small nod. Then he turned back to the bench. My third piece of evidence, Your Honor. He pulled out a thick section of handwritten pages, charts, numbers, case references, all compiled by hand from public records he'd requested through FOIA. I analyzed Judge Whitfield's sentencing records over the past 30 years. I looked at every felony case in her courtroom where sentencing data was publicly available. He read the numbers. Calm. Flat. No drama. Just facts. Black defendants in Judge Whitfield's courtroom received sentences that were, on average, 40% longer than white defendants convicted of the same offenses under the same statutes. In 14 capital cases where the death penalty was sought, 13 of the defendants were black. 13 out of 14. He let the numbers sit in the air. One more thing, Your Honor. Terrence pulled out the final document, a sworn affidavit from retired Detective Ray Sullivan. He read the key passage aloud. Sullivan states that he was pressured by then Assistant District Attorney Bryce Coleman and by the office of Senator Hal Dawson to close the Gaines case quickly. He states that the investigation was incomplete, and he names Judge Whitfield as someone who, quote, made it clear she wanted a conviction, not a trial. Terrence set the affidavit down and looked across the room. Catherine Whitfield was no longer sitting straight. She was leaning toward her attorney, whispering something. Her hand was gripping the edge of the table. She wasn't looking at the gallery. She wasn't looking at the bench. And for the first time since this hearing began, she wasn't looking at Terrence Robinson. Because she couldn't. Like, are you serious right now? They didn't even test the damn blood. One test! And this man never sees death row. But nobody gave a damn. Not the judge, not the detective, not the senator. A black man in cuffs? Good enough. That's not justice. That's a damn setup. What happened next started with a mistake, but not Terrence's mistake. Gerald Crawford's. The evidence had hit hard. The DNA, the recantation, the sentencing data, the affidavit. Crawford could feel the room slipping away from him. The gallery, the bench, even his own client. Whitfield was gripping the table like it was the only thing holding her up. He needed to regain control. He needed to make the courtroom stop looking at the evidence and start looking at the man presenting it. So he attacked. Crawford stood up, straightened his tie, and turned to face Judge Abrams with the kind of righteous indignation that only expensive lawyers know how to manufacture. Your Honor, I must object to this entire proceeding being hijacked by, and I say this with respect, a construction worker, a man who pours concrete for a living. We are sitting in a federal courtroom listening to handwritten notes from a convicted criminal who apparently believes he understands the law better than the State Bar of Georgia. He turned toward Terrence. Slowly, deliberately. "Tell me, Mr. Robinson, where exactly did you learn all of this? In the prison yard? Between push-ups?"
A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Crawford smiled. He thought he'd landed the blow. He thought he'd reminded the room who Terrence really was. A man in a jumpsuit with no credentials and no business standing in a federal court. He was wrong. And what came next would be replayed, clipped, shared, and screenshotted more times than any other moment in this story. Terrence stood. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He just stood there, calm as a man who'd been waiting for exactly this question his entire life. "Howard University School of Law," he said. "Class of 2016. Juris Doctor. I graduated first in my class." The courtroom went still. "I passed the Georgia State Bar on my first attempt. Top 2%. I completed an internship at the federal prosecutor's office in Atlanta. I was offered a position in constitutional law at one of the top firms in the state." Crawford's mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. "Then my wife died. And I had 2 children under 5 and no one to help raise them. So I put my degree in a drawer, picked up a hard hat, and went to pour concrete. Because my kids needed a father more than the legal system needed another lawyer." Terrence paused. He looked directly at Crawford, eye to eye. "I stopped practicing law, but the law never left me. So to answer your question, counselor, no, I didn't learn this in the prison yard." A beat. "I just reviewed my notes there." Silence. Not the awkward silence of confusion. The deep silence of a room full of people realizing they had been looking at someone and seeing the completely wrong person. Then the murmurs came. Low at first, then building. A woman in the gallery whispered to the person next to her. A reporter's pen stopped moving because her hand was shaking. The federal marshal by the side door, the one who had tilted his head earlier, who had sensed something he couldn't name, closed his eyes and nodded once, like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Judge Abrams didn't call for order. He just sat, very still, and looked at Terrence with an expression that wasn't surprise exactly. It was closer to recognition. One legal mind seeing another for the first time. Crawford stood frozen at his table. His mouth was still slightly open. He had no follow-up, no redirect, no recovery. He had just handed Terrence Robinson the single most powerful moment in the entire hearing, and there was no taking it back. And then there was Whitfield. Catherine Whitfield was staring at Terrence, not with contempt this time, not with the dismissive flick of the eyes she'd given him in her courtroom. She was staring at him the way you stare at something you suddenly realize has been dangerous all along, something you mistook for harmless because you never bothered to look closely. She was afraid. For the first time in 30 years on the bench, Catherine Whitfield was afraid of a man she had once called an animal. In the front row, Naomi Robinson sat with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap. Her lips were moving. A prayer, a thank you, a breath she'd been holding since the moment they put handcuffs on her son. Beside her, Terrence's daughter, 19 years old now, sitting where her grandmother had gripped the bench until her knuckles turned white, reached over and took Naomi's hand. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And the narrator said this: "That is what happens when you judge someone by what they look like. You don't see the blade until it has already turned." Terrence Robinson asked permission to cross-examine the respondent. Judge Abrams granted it. And in that moment, something in the room shifted. Up until now, Terrence had been presenting, telling his story, laying out evidence, building his case brick by brick. But cross-examination is a different thing entirely. Cross-examination is surgery. And Terrence picked up the scalpel like a man who'd been born holding one. He walked to the center of the courtroom. No notes, no stack of papers, just his voice and his eyes and a series of questions that Catherine Whitfield never saw coming. He started simple. Judge Whitfield, in your 30 years on the bench, can you name 5 black defendants who appeared in your courtroom? Whitfield blinked. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes moved to the left, searching, scanning, and came back empty. I've presided over thousands of cases. I can't be expected to remember individual names from 5 names, Terrence said. Out of thousands, just 5. Silence. Whitfield straightened in her chair. I don't recall specific names offhand. That doesn't mean, can you name 5 white defendants? The question hit like a slap. Whitfield's mouth tightened. But she answered, almost automatically, like a reflex she couldn't control. James Holcomb, embezzlement. Sandra Price, fraud. William Chambers, aggravated assault with... She stopped. She realized what she'd just done. 3 names, with details, without a second's hesitation. For white defendants, she remembered clearly. While she couldn't produce a single black name from 3 decades on the bench, Terrence didn't comment. He didn't need to. Every person in that courtroom had just watched the same thing happen in real time. The silence did the work. He moved on, sharper now, faster. Judge Whitfield, why did you deny the defense's motion for a 3-week continuance in my trial? Standard procedure. Continuances are granted at the court's discretion, and why did you allow testimony from a jailhouse informant with no corroborating evidence? The prosecution vouched for the reliability of why did you not recuse yourself from the case after Senator Hal Dawson, your personal friend, who attended your daughter's wedding, who donated to your re-election campaign, publicly called for a conviction in the Harold Gaines murder before the trial even started? Nothing. Whitfield's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her attorney half rose from his seat, then sat back down, as if he'd already calculated that any objection would only make things worse. The question hung in the air like smoke. Terrence waited. 5 seconds. 10. He was comfortable in the silence. Whitfield was not. Then he changed direction again. I'd like to read 3 names into the record, Your Honor. Judge Abrams nodded. Terrence spoke each name slowly, clearly, like each one weighed something. Darnell Foster, sentenced to 25 years for armed robbery. No prior convictions. A white defendant in Judge Whitfield's courtroom, convicted of the same charge, the same year, received 8 years. Marcus, Terrence caught himself, glanced at his notes, corrected. Reginald Cole, sentenced to life for second-degree murder on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution's key witness later recanted. No appeal was granted. Anthony Williams, 19 years old, sentenced to 15 years for possession with intent to distribute. The quantity involved was consistent with personal use. A white defendant with a larger quantity, same courtroom, same year, received probation. Terrence looked at Whitfield. Do you remember any of these men, Judge Whitfield? I've handled thousands of... You don't remember them. 3 lives, 3 families destroyed, and you don't remember a single one of their faces. Whitfield's composure cracked. Not slowly, suddenly, like a dam that had been holding too long. Her voice came out sharp, bitter, loud enough to fill the room. I don't have to justify 30 years of service to someone who... She stopped. The sentence hung in the air, unfinished. But everyone heard it. Everyone knew exactly how that sentence was going to end. The reporter in the third row stopped writing. A juror's hand went to her mouth. Judge Abrams stared at Whitfield with an expression that was no longer neutral. Crawford dropped his head into his hands. Whitfield realized what she'd almost said. She closed her mouth. She pressed her lips together until they turned white. But it was too late. The mask had slipped, and the face underneath it was exactly what Terrence's evidence had already proven it to be. Terrence didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't shake his head. He simply turned to Judge Abrams and said quietly, "No further questions, Your Honor." He walked back to his table and sat down. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Whitfield sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She didn't look up. She didn't move. She looked like a woman who had just watched 30 years of reputation collapse in under 10 minutes and knew there was nothing left to save. Judge Abrams looked at Terrence. "Does the petitioner wish to make a closing statement?" Terrence stood. He didn't bring the stack of papers. He didn't bring notes. He didn't bring anything. He just stood in the center of the courtroom with his hands at his sides and spoke. And for the first time in this hearing, he wasn't speaking to the judge. He wasn't speaking to Crawford. He wasn't speaking to Whitfield. He was speaking to every person in that room, and to every person who would ever hear this story. "My daughter's name is Alyssa," he said. "She was 3 years old the morning they put handcuffs on me in my kitchen. She dropped her spoon. She didn't understand what was happening. She just stood there and watched them take me out the front door. My son, Marcus, he was 5. He didn't cry. He just stood very still, the way children do when they're trying to be brave because they think their father is watching." Terrence paused, not for effect, because the words were heavy and he needed a moment to carry them. "I told them I'd be home that night. I believed it. I thought, this is America. I didn't do anything. They'll figure it out. They'll look at the evidence. They'll see the truth. I'll be home by dinner." He shook his head slowly. "I wasn't home by dinner. I wasn't home by Christmas. I wasn't home when Alyssa lost her first tooth, or when Marcus hit his first home run at the park where I used to coach, or when my mother had surgery and sat in the recovery room alone because her son was on death row for something he didn't do." A woman in the gallery pressed her hand against her mouth. A man in the second row wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Naomi Robinson sat perfectly still, tears running down both cheeks, making no sound at all. "My mother called the prison every single day," Terrence continued. "Every day. She never missed one. Some days they put her through. Some days they didn't. Some days she sat on hold for 40 minutes and the line went dead. She called back. Every time. For every single day since they took me." He let that sit. Then he broadened. "But this case is not just about me. And it's not just about Judge Whitfield. It's about the system that let this happen. The district attorney's office that never once reviewed Whitfield's sentencing patterns, even though the disparity was visible to anyone who looked. The State Bar Association that received complaints and filed them away without investigation. The political machine that protected her for 30 years because she was..." He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Tough on crime." And everyone in this state understood what that phrase really meant. Everyone knew who it was tough on. And everyone looked the other way. Terence took one breath. Then he delivered the last line of his closing. I didn't fail the system. The system failed me. And it failed me on purpose. He sat down. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of his chair scraping the floor echoed off the walls. Judge Abrams didn't speak immediately. He looked at his notes. He looked at the evidence binders. He looked at Whitfield, who was sitting with her eyes fixed on the table and her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Then he spoke. This court finds that Judge Catherine Whitfield engaged in a sustained pattern of judicial misconduct, including, but not limited to, the suppression of exculpatory evidence, the denial of constitutionally guaranteed due process protections, and the systematic application of racially biased sentencing practices over a period of 3 decades. This court further finds that these actions constitute violations of federal civil rights statutes and amount to conspiracy to obstruct justice. He paused. The room held its breath. The respondent, Catherine Whitfield, is hereby sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. 40 years. The same number that Terence would have spent waiting for a needle in his arm if no one had ever looked twice at his case. The symmetry was not lost on anyone. Whitfield did not react. She did not cry. She did not protest. 2 federal marshals walked to her table. She stood. They placed handcuffs on her wrists, the same wrists that had signed Terence's death warrant. And they led her out of the courtroom through the side door. She didn't look back. She didn't say a word. In a separate ruling issued simultaneously, Terence Robinson's conviction was vacated. All charges were dismissed. He was ordered released immediately. The next scene is the one that matters most. And it's the simplest one in this entire story. A prison gate. Late afternoon light. The kind of golden light that makes everything look like it's been waiting for something. Terence Robinson walked through that gate in the same clothes he'd been arrested in. He stopped on the other side and stood still for a moment, like a man who'd forgotten what open air tasted like. And there was Naomi, standing exactly where she said she would be. Not sitting on a bench, not waiting in a car. Standing. Right at the gate. The way she'd been standing in her heart every single day since they took her son. Neither of them spoke. Terence walked to her. She opened her arms. He folded into them. This tall, strong man who had just brought down a 30-year institution with handwritten pages and a borrowed pen. He folded into his mother's arms like a child, and he whispered, "I'm home, Mama." Naomi closed her eyes. She held him, and for the first time in days that had felt like decades, she breathed. In the hallway outside the courtroom, a young black law student stopped Terence as he was walking out. She was holding a notebook. Her hands were shaking. "Mr. Robinson, how did you know you were going to win?" Terence looked at her. He almost smiled. Almost. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew somebody had to try. And there was nobody left but me." After the verdict, the dominoes fell fast. Catherine Whitfield was permanently disbarred. Her law license, the one she'd held for over 3 decades, was revoked within 72 hours of sentencing. The State Bar Association, the same institution that had ignored complaints about her for years, issued a public statement calling her conduct a fundamental betrayal of judicial ethics. They didn't mention that they'd had the chance to stop her a dozen times, and never did. Every felony case Whitfield had presided over was flagged for review. Over the next 2 years, 9 additional convictions were overturned. 9 people, 9 families, 9 lives that had been bent and broken by the same hands in the same courtroom under the same robe. Some of those people had already served their full sentences. They got letters of exoneration and nothing else. No apology, no compensation. Just a piece of paper that said the system was sorry. Years too late. Senator Hal Dawson faced a federal investigation into political interference in criminal cases. He resigned from office before the inquiry was completed. He never made a public statement. Detective Ray Sullivan cooperated fully with federal prosecutors and received a reduced sentence for his role in fabricating the case. Former ADA Bryce Coleman held a press conference with shaking hands and apologized publicly for his role in the prosecution.
He established a wrongful conviction fund with his own money. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. But he did it anyway. And Terrence Robinson? He went home. He cooked dinner for his kids. He sat at the kitchen table where he used to help with homework and ate a meal in his own house for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. His daughter sat across from him and kept looking at him, like she was making sure he was real. His son didn't say much. He just sat close. Close enough to touch his father's arm every few minutes, the way you touch something you're afraid might disappear. Terrence went back to coaching Little League at the park behind Mount Olive Church. Same field. New bats. He bought them himself this time. The kids didn't know his story. They just knew Coach Terry was back. Every Tuesday evening, he drove to the county detention center and sat in a room with a folding table and a stack of legal textbooks. He taught inmates how to read case law, how to file motions, how to understand their own rights. He didn't charge anything. He didn't publicize it. He just showed up every week, sat down, and taught, because he knew what it felt like to sit in a cell with no one coming, and he decided that as long as he was breathing, no one else would have to feel that alone. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a book. He never went on television. His mother finally slept through the night. Man, imagine that's you. Innocent, in handcuffs, and the judge is the one destroying your life. This story is fiction, but that feeling is real. What would you do? Drop a comment. Like, share, and subscribe. Next one's a janitor who took down an entire corporation.